Alexis Salazar's senior speech. This young lady joined us just last year, and I'm so glad that she ended up in my advisory. We'd like to say a warm welcome to her family and friends who are here today. Thank you so much for joining us. If you don't know Alexis, you're missing out. This young lady can come across as quiet and shy, but once you get to know her, you'll quickly realize that she is so smart, so clever, and has an awesome sense of humor, and a dazzling smile. She has a heart of gold and is full of kindness. She has asked me to say this prior to her speech. Viewer discretion is advised, as some may find these topics, such as forced sterilization, forced removal of a person's reproductive rights, as disturbing or uncomfortable. She just wanted to give you that heads up. And Alexis, thank you for that heads up. And now, welcome to the stage, Alexis Salazar.
Is brought to you by these sponsors: my family and friends, Mr. Boyd, Ms. Farrar, Mr. Kennedy, William, Robin and Robert, Mochi the cat, and a special thanks to Mrs. Chopshu for the introduction. Our story begins in 1994 when scientists Richard Bernstein and Charles Murray published a book that would shock the nation. The public was stunned by the bell curve, their study that claimed a person's IQ depended on their race and that their social status and mobility was determined by their genetics, which favored those of Anglo-Saxon descent over others. Although their eugenic claims were false and had been disproven by past and present geneticists, many believed in their racially biased claims that especially discriminated against African Americans. How could lead experts, such as James Watson, former president of the National Center for the Human Genome Research, believe in such obviously racist texts? How could this have happened just 3 decades ago? And what was exactly so scary about this case? What is eugenics? My senior speech is Remembering Our History, Eugenics and Scientific Discrimination. In order to understand things fully, we need context. Humans have always been curious and looking for ways to understand the concept of why certain people live and act certain ways. In 1859, Darwin published The Origin of Species and publicly spread his idea of traits being passed down from parent to offspring. Now, a few years later, his cousin, Francis Galton, would apply this theory to more than just physical traits, but traits such as personality and even career and lifestyle. Just as many believed in Darwin's ideas in order to breed the best cattle or flowers, people began to believe in Galton's theory of being able to produce the best person. He called this idea eugenics, based off the Greek roots for well-born. Eugenics is the belief in creating a better human population through selective reproduction. Now, the 1800s was a time of major population growth in the US, and was also a time of poverty, disease, and major immigration from Europe. It was also a time of scientific breakthrough. People were in need of a way to understand social ills around them, and just as many scientists do, they looked for what stood out. In this particular case, they looked for who stood out: people of color, LGBT+ individuals, and individuals with disabilities. A new movement began to sweep the nation. Hoping to find the source and a cure for their community's problems, public and private programs began to form throughout the early 1900s. The American Eugenics Society took surveys and examined pedigrees and the lineage of families nationwide, and determined that there was a correlation between social ills and people of minority populations. These scientists claimed that people of minority groups, such as immigrants and individuals of colors, caused social ills such as poverty and inherited it from their ancestors. They believed that intermarriage between these individuals and individuals of Anglo-Saxon descent would cause people to inherit social ills. Convinced, people began to spread awareness by holding eugenic exhibits, family contests, and public classes to teach who should and shouldn't be allowed to have children and hold jobs. Even pastors and teachers joined in the endeavor to create a better human race. And although most community and government leaders made eugenic decisions for the better of their people around them and their communities, the negative effects of their mission cannot be forgotten. From the early 1900s, well into the 1980s, from 200,000 to 1 million Americans of color, disabilities, and of the gay community were forcibly sterilized through eugenic government programs. And forced sterilization wasn't just happening in the US. Renowned scientists across the globe, such as Charles Davenport, would be taking these idealized methods from the US and using them in their countries, such as Nazi Germany, where the full force of negative eugenics would cause millions of people of minority groups to be killed or sterilized, especially Jews, who were also targeted in the United States. Eugenic practices such as institutionalization were happening across the globe, and people of minority groups, especially people with disabilities, continue to be institutionalized today, especially in European countries such as Ukraine. As it is best said by Paul Longmore, clearly there is a lot of work yet to do.
Disability rights are a part of civil rights history, but in order for that to be understood by the masses, we've got to get behind it in the ways that people have fought to include other things.
Archival footage of iconic civil rights protests. A protest sign reads, "We shall overcome."
Race, ethnicity, gender, age, sexuality. People had to claw and scratch and fight and protest and pass legislation in order for those things to get recognized as valid. Let's walk through some of those significant moments in disability history. 1909.
Let's talk a bit about the dark history of eugenics.
For most of human history, disability has been a diagnosis, something to be cured, fixed, and cut out across the United States. From 1909 through the 1970s, disabled women, disabled men were put into institutions, were sterilized against their will and often without their knowledge. The words that were used, feeble-minded, idiot, moron, they were all meant to segregate and separate. The reverberations of that continue to play out now, 100 years later. 1935. If you hear the word sit-in, you're likely to think about the American South, the civil rights protests of African Americans. But decades before, in eastern cities like New York City, Manhattan, groups like the League of the Physically Handicapped were sitting in for their right to work. After the Great Depression, 1935, everybody was hit hard. People with disabilities were specifically excluded from projects from the Works Progress Administration under the FDR administration. People with disabilities who had met at a recreational center in New York City said, wait a minute, why should we settle for second-class status? And the day they said that to me, the sit-in began. One of the first recorded sit-ins in United States history. So why did it take a disabled historian, someone like Paul Longmore, to uncover this fact decades later? This should be taught alongside the Freedom Riders, alongside Stonewall. This is one of those moments where people said, we're going to demand access to the same things that everybody else gets to take for granted, and yet people don't know about it.
Just as Longmore argues in this video, we must look to our past to make sense of our present and move together towards a better future. There have always been groups fighting against forced sterilization, such as the women here protesting in the 70s for their rights. But over here, we see the Chief Warpin for more recent protests from the 90s. When we teach about history and negative eugenics, the Nazis have always been the prime example, but people are seldom ever taught about the eugenic exhibits we held. At the same time, the Nazis held anti-Jew exhibits in Germany. We are always taught about the mass graves in Germany, but we are never taught about the millions of Americans buried in American soil, without a tombstone or record, after having been given a number as a name and lived their entire lives encaged in their own country in an institution. Why do people not know? Many of you are wondering why you have never heard of the information I have told you today. And you are not alone. Most history textbooks and classes do not offer information on eugenics in the U.S. Most don't describe the 1977 protest for 504, which had the longest sit-in in a federal building in U.S. history. No civil rights history book I have ever read included the Capitol Crawl of 1990, or the 2007 UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. As a person of a minority race and of neurodivergency, I can say with certainty that the reverberations of discrimination justified by eugenics continues today, from the R word and terms such as idiot and moron, to the negative connotations people put on words such as handicapped and disabled. As the art activist Banksy put through his mural here, we are all in the same boat. We are all human beings. We must look to the past to make the best decision now in order to move forward into a better world. Now, as to why I started my speech out with the bell curve case, as we navigate our ever-changing world of scientific innovation and genetic engineering, we need to look to the past and review our past mistakes to prevent practices akin to the negative eugenic policies from thriving in our country and our world's environment. We cannot forget about the past. We won't be left behind any longer. Thank you for listening. Please take care of each other.